Starting or preventing a war can be as simple as making a tough decision and pressing a button. That's a decision that one mind had to make. One man who stood between us and global annihilation. He was a simple man who believed in the common good, and it was this guiding instinct that convinced a regular Soviet soldier that the computer warning flashing on his screen about an incoming nuclear missile attack was in fact a false alarm. If he was wrong, his motherland could be destroyed, and a retaliation of missiles would be fired, creating a domino effect of nuclear explosions worldwide. But if he was right, then he'd save all of humankind. So what was it like in those crucial seconds? What was his thought process? And why was he being punished for preventing the end of the world? Well, it's time to learn how history works to understand everything that led up to this fateful decision and how the world almost changed on a dime. It all went down on the 26th of September 1983, when a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel of the Soviet Air Defense Forces started his shift. His name was Stanislav Petrov, and he was sitting at this terminal when the screen showed 5 nuclear missiles leaving the US and heading to Russia, his motherland. Presumably back then, the graphics looked like something from an arcade version of Missile Command, but for Petrov, it was all too real. Now he had a choice: pick up the phone and report the incident to the higher-ups, where the issue will be out of his hands, or he could make the decision himself. It's hard to imagine what we might do in that situation, but Petrov, he didn't have time to think. He had only a few minutes to potentially decide the outcome of the Cold War and the future of humanity. By this point in the Cold War, NATO in the West and the Soviet Union in the East had built up enough stockpile of nuclear warheads and delivery systems to overwhelm any chance of defense from the opposing side. The only thing stopping the great powers from destroying one another was the threat of mutually assured destruction. If the Soviet Union launched 45,000 nuclear warheads at the West would counter-launch their 31,000 warheads right back and vice versa. 76,000 nuclear weapons going off within the span of an hour of hostile exchanges would end the world. Ignoring completely the damage a nuclear blast can do to a city, the radioactive fallout and ash clouds would make the planet totally unlivable for most organisms. Some nuclear physicists joked that it would be more efficient for these hostile nations to just set the bombs off in their own backyard and not bother with the fancy delivery systems, because that many nuclear weapons would end the world either way. It has been said that this mutually assured destruction, where each has the weapons to outdo the other's defenses, was a paradoxical form of world peace. Surely in this scenario, no one would be foolish enough to fire a missile if they knew it would result in their own death, right? This was the mentality, and it's not totally crazy. Direct wars between major world powers have been practically non-existent since the introduction of nuclear weapons. Just look at what's happening with Russia at this very moment. Nobody dares get directly too involved out of the fear of direct nuclear retaliation. So it was tempting to brush off this long period of the Cold War as nothing more than hollow showboating. All bark, no bite. On September 1st, 1983, the Soviets tested this uneasy standoff when they shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, proving that yes, a fight was not a question of if, but when. According to flight information, the crew had drifted from its original planned route and unintentionally flew through Soviet prohibited airspace at the same time as a US aerial reconnaissance mission was underway. The Soviet Air Force treated the unidentified aircraft as another intruding spy plane, so they fired warning shots. However, the pilots did not react, most likely because they didn't see them. Years later, however, one of the Soviet pilots said that without tracer rounds, their shots would have been invisible. So now, the Soviets continued with the next logical step and launched air-to-air missiles. Shrapnel from the warhead severed control wires in the tail and leaked pressurized gas from the cabin. The pilots were able to regain control, but not for long, as the aircraft oscillated and broke up thousands of feet above the water. All 269 souls on board died, and according to a report from the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, it is likely that passengers remained conscious the entire time. Because of this incident, tensions between all countries were higher than ever, so there was never a coordinated search and recovery mission. No information was shared, which only proved that even a catastrophic loss in civilian lives would do little to unify the opposing sides. It would be further aggravated by the Soviet Union denying any involvement until a US presentation to the United Nations Security Council included intercepted radio calls from the Russian fighters. Still, the Soviets denied any wreckage, bodies, or flight recorders had ever been found, though this would be U-turned years later, after the end of the Cold War. But until then, the shooting down of the Korean flight set the stage for Stanislav Petrov's world-changing decision just 3 weeks later, when his computer screen starts flashing. It was the early morning at Serpukhov 15 station, just outside Moscow, when he heard a sound. It was an alarm, the ballistic missile alarm. it meant that Soviet satellites had detected an intercontinental missile launch. As Petrov gathered his thoughts, 4 more were fired, one after another. Now, the alarm had switched to missile strike, and showed that the reliability of these warnings was at its highest. That means it was very confident. Petrov had to do something. He studied radio engineering at a Soviet base in Kyiv, and rose through the ranks of the Soviet Air Forces over the next years to become a critical link in the chain of command. It was now his job to oversee the staff who monitored signals from early warning satellites, yet there was no specific rule for deciding if something was a false alarm or not. However, these circumstances meant that protocol would dictate that he would have to promptly send any early warning signs up the chain of command so that his superiors could act quickly. Yet, he knew that this just meant he was giving someone else a chance to make the wrong decision. Perhaps the farther up the chain of command it went, the more likely someone was to assume it was a real threat. The room of juniors all stared at Petrov, who sat in cold silence. All the while, the alarms of the monitoring room blared, warning the soldiers of the incoming missile strikes. He couldn't bring himself to report it, yet he knew that doing nothing could be a fatal mistake. After 5 nail-biting minutes, Petrov reported it as a false alarm. His decision was trusted by the higher-ups, but now Petrov had to wait and see if he was correct. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, like the ones Petrov had potentially just detected, travel at 8 times the speed of sound and launch into space before returning to their target back on Earth. The whole process takes no longer than 30 minutes from launch to impact, so we wouldn't need to wait long for an answer. One thing that stuck in his mind was how bizarre it was that the US would attack with just 5 missiles from their arsenal of thousands. The US knew it would result in retaliation, and even with Ronald Reagan recently calling the USSR an empire of evil, why would the US have a weak opening gambit? 25 minutes later, and Petrov released that if there had been any bomb detonations, he would have heard it by now. It turned out that the primitive 80s tech had meant that the coding in the satellites confused the sun's reflection off the top of the clouds with missile launches. Though the coding was supposed to filter out this sort of thing, it simply wasn't coded well enough. In any case, the code was rewritten, and Petrov would state in interviews years later that he was aware of how hastily the code was written in the wake of the US's own detection system. Therefore, he did not consider the system 100% reliable. A decade later, he told the Washington Post that his decision came down to a gut feeling, a knowledge that the humans who designed computers were wiser than their creations. Petrov was initially praised for his calm thinking by General Yuri Votintsev, the then commander of the Soviet Air Defense's missile defense units. He described Petrov's actions as the right decision, and he was promised a reward for his courage. But the initial praise was quickly reversed, and he was soon investigated over the incident. They wanted to know why he didn't follow protocol, and why he failed to log this in his notebook. He famously replied that he had a phone in one hand, an intercom in the other, so didn't have a third hand to write down notes. And he never received the reward either, because the incident and later bugs found in the missile detection system embarrassed his superiors and the scientists who designed it. The story was kept from the public because it revealed flaws in Soviet systems which, according to propaganda, were perfect in every way. Petrov was moved to a less important role in the Air Force and mostly forgotten after the incident. Not long after, he would leave the Air Force to grow potatoes. It's fitting that the man who saved the world went on to become a humble potato farmer. In 1998, a retired commander's memoir spilled the beans. From then on, the world came to know how Petrov had done them a solid, and he's since received numerous humanitarian awards until dying in 2017, at the age of 77. Petrov embodies the moral conundrum of just following orders. On one hand, he was a military officer who had sworn an allegiance to serve his country. Militaries depend on soldiers following orders and protocols to function correctly, even if that means doing things they don't agree with personally. In these types of environments, making a decision, any decision, can be a very risky thing to do. Anything that even resembles a failure in the ranks of the perfect Soviet army would be seen as nothing other than a personal failing that could get you demoted or sent to the gulag. Because of this culture, it has been well documented that many Soviet officers did little more than pass orders up and down the chain of command, avoiding as much independent thinking as possible in the process. The very idea of actually breaking protocol and leaving superiors out of the loop would have been unthinkable to most. Stanislav Petrov was a true hero in every sense of the word. He knew he was risking his life to give the world a chance at surviving annihilation. Doing the right thing at such an important situation can be a hard thing to do, especially when the only 2 options are destruction or jail. Fortunately, he didn't face a sentence for not following the nuclear playbook. His military superiors accepted his experience as a systems operator and saw no wrongdoing in his decision to call the incident a false alarm. Truthfully, they probably knew that Petrov had saved their lives as well. A former KGB chief said that the Soviet leader Yuri Andropov had high distrust of the American leaders, and that he would have acted on the threat that Petrov refused to report. Honestly, even though he made the right decision, Petrov was fortunate to not find himself in a gulag, and the world was fortunate not to have a weaker man at that post. Now you have learned about how one man saved the world with an incredible act of heroism, go learn about how another man created chaos with a single word, by watching my video on how a one-word slip-up brought down the Berlin Wall. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.